The woman staring back at me from the photograph was my exact mirror image, but she was wearing my wedding dress, standing next to my husband on what was supposed to be my wedding day. Every detail was perfect, the same face, the same smile, the same birthmark on her left hand that I'd carried my entire life. The lace sleeves of the dress fit her perfectly because they had been tailored for my measurements, and the bouquet of white roses she carried was identical to the one I'd chosen months earlier when I thought I was planning my own wedding. The groom's face was glowing with happiness as he gazed at what he believed was his bride, completely unaware that he was marrying an imposter who had stolen not just my dress, but my entire identity. But this wasn't a case of mistaken identity or old family photos getting mixed up. This was evidence that my twin sister Sarah had been systematically stealing my life, piece by piece, for 40 years while I lived in poverty and isolation, believing I was the family outcast who had been abandoned by everyone I loved. The photograph was just one piece of a massive collection of evidence showing Sarah living my life, using my name, claiming my achievements, and building relationships with people who thought they knew me but had actually been interacting with my sister for decades. But let me tell you how it all started, because this story will make you question everything you think you know about family loyalty, and wonder how someone could steal not just your possessions, but your entire existence while the world around you remained completely unaware that the wrong person was living your life. My name is Margaret Thompson, and at 78 years old, I finally discovered that my twin sister Sarah had been impersonating me and living my life for 4 decades while I struggled alone, believing I was the rejected twin who had lost everything due to my own failures and bad choices. We were born on June 15, 1945, just 17 minutes apart, with Sarah emerging first and me following so closely behind that the doctor initially thought we were a single, unusually large baby. Our mother often told the story of how surprised everyone was when a second baby appeared, and how the nurses had to scramble to find a second bassinet because they'd only prepared for one infant. Growing up in small-town Nebraska, Sarah and I were identical in every physical way. Same height, same weight, same facial features, same voice, even the same distinctive birthmark on our left hands that looked like a tiny star. The birthmark was so unusual that people often commented on it, saying it looked like we'd been marked by angels or destined for something special. Our fingerprints were so similar that even school officials had trouble telling them apart, and our voices were so identical that we could answer each other's phone calls without the caller realizing they were speaking to the wrong twin. But our personalities were completely different from birth. Sarah was outgoing, charming, and manipulative, always able to convince adults that she was innocent while I took the blame for her misbehavior. She had an instinctive understanding of how to read people's emotions and tell them exactly what they wanted to hear, while I was naturally honest and often said things that were true, but not necessarily what people wanted to hear. I was quieter, more honest, and unfortunately more trusting of my sister's explanations for why things always seemed to go wrong for me. Sarah would convince me that misunderstandings and problems were my fault, that I had said or done things I couldn't remember, or that my memory was unreliable and I should trust her version of events instead of my own recollections. Our parents, Frank and Mary Thompson, struggled to tell us apart physically, especially when we were young and our personality differences weren't as obvious. They would often call us by the wrong names, ask us to remind them which twin we were, or simply refer to us collectively as the girls rather than using our individual names. This constant confusion created opportunities for Sarah to manipulate situations by pretending to be me when it served her purposes. Sarah learned early that she could convince our parents that she was me when it served her purposes, and that I was too loyal and confused to expose her deceptions even when I knew what she was doing. She would switch identities with me during piano lessons when she hadn't practiced, during parent-teacher conferences when she'd gotten in trouble at school, and even during medical appointments when she was afraid of getting shots or having dental work done. The identity switching became so routine that I began to doubt my own memory and perception of events. Sarah would insist that I was confused about which experiences belonged to which twin, and that my attempts to correct the record were evidence of jealousy or mental instability rather than legitimate efforts to reclaim my own experiences and achievements. Our teachers and neighbors often commented on how different we were becoming as we got older, noting that Margaret, who was actually Sarah pretending to be me during public interactions, was so much more confident and outgoing than she used to be, while Sarah, who was actually me being forced to assume Sarah's identity and reputation, seemed to be becoming more withdrawn and troubled. As we grew older, the identity confusion became more deliberate and systematic. Sarah would pretend to be me during important conversations with teachers, friends, and family members, creating relationships and making commitments that I knew nothing about. When these situations inevitably led to problems or disappointments, I would be blamed for Sarah's actions while she remained above suspicion. Sarah also began using our physical similarity to create alibis for herself when she wanted to engage in activities that our parents had forbidden. She would make sure I was seen in public places where she was supposed to be, while she went off to engage in risky or forbidden behavior that could have serious consequences if she were caught. By the time we reached adulthood, Sarah had perfected the art of identity manipulation, using our physical similarity to create advantages for herself while ensuring that any negative consequences fell on me instead. She had trained our entire family and social circle to expect certain behaviors and characteristics from each of us, making it nearly impossible for me to prove when Sarah was impersonating me or taking credit for my achievements. Before I continue my story, I really want to know where you're watching me from. Tell me in the comments what city you're from, and if you can, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel, because what I'm about to tell you next will shatter your understanding of sibling relationships and reveal how completely someone can steal your identity when they have unlimited access to your personal information and the trust of everyone around you. The systematic theft of my identity began in earnest when we turned 21 and left our family home to start independent adult lives. Sarah and I had planned to move to Chicago together, sharing an apartment and helping each other adjust to big city life after growing up in a small farming community where everyone had known us since birth. We'd spent months saving money from summer jobs at the local diner and grain elevator, researched neighborhoods through library books and newspaper classified ads, and even filled out apartment applications together during a weekend trip to Chicago in the spring. Our plan seemed perfect and mutually beneficial. We would share expenses, provide emotional support for each other during the challenging transition to adult independence, and use our twin connection as an advantage in a big city where we knew no one and had no family connections to help us get established. But when we arrived in Chicago with our shared savings and carefully planned living arrangements, Sarah immediately began implementing a plan that would gradually separate me from all the opportunities and relationships we'd intended to share. She convinced me that we'd be more successful if we lived separately and developed our own individual identities rather than being seen as the twin sisters who did everything together. Sarah's reasoning seemed logical and mature at the time. She argued that potential employers, landlords, and romantic partners would take us more seriously as individuals rather than as a matched set, and that living independently would help us grow into our own unique personalities rather than always being compared to each other or expected to make decisions as a unit. She pointed out examples of other twins we'd known who had struggled to establish individual identities, and she painted a compelling picture of how much more successful we could be if we approached our new life in Chicago as separate individuals who happened to be sisters rather than as a twin unit that came as a package deal. What I didn't realize was that Sarah had already begun the process of claiming my identity and opportunities while positioning me to take responsibility for her failures and debts. During our weekend apartment hunting trip, she had secretly met with landlords and employers using my name and credentials while encouraging me to explore options that would turn out to be less desirable or even fraudulent. Sarah had used my name and personal information to secure the better apartment we'd looked at together, while convincing me to accept a smaller, more expensive place in a less desirable neighborhood. She'd applied for jobs using my credentials and educational background, which were slightly better than hers, while encouraging me to pursue more suitable employment opportunities that turned out to be dead-end positions with no advancement potential. Most devastatingly, Sarah had begun dating Robert Mitchell, the man I'd met and fallen in love with during our first week in Chicago, while convincing me that he wasn't interested in a serious relationship and that I should focus on my career rather than pursuing romantic entanglements that would distract from my goals. But what I discovered 40 years later would reveal that Sarah's identity theft was far more comprehensive and systematic than simple sibling rivalry or competition for better opportunities. Sarah had been studying identity theft techniques and legal loopholes that would allow her to gradually assume my identity completely, while ensuring that I couldn't prove who I really was or reclaim the life she'd stolen from me. The plan Sarah implemented was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its completeness. By using my name and credentials for all her successful endeavors while ensuring that I was associated with failures and problems, Sarah gradually created a public record that showed Margaret Thompson as a successful, responsible, well-connected individual, while the real Margaret Thompson, me, appeared to be a troubled, unreliable person with a history of poor decisions and failed relationships. Over the course of several years, Sarah systematically took over every aspect of my identity. She used my social security number to establish credit accounts and build a positive financial history. She applied for professional licenses using my educational credentials. She developed relationships with my college friends and family members, gradually convincing them that she was the real Margaret, while I was struggling with mental health issues or personal problems that made me unreliable and difficult to maintain relationships with. But the most devastating aspect of Sarah's identity theft was her relationship with Robert Mitchell, the man who became the husband I never had and the father of children I never got to raise. Robert genuinely believed he was dating, and eventually married Margaret Thompson, not realizing that the woman he fell in love with was actually my twin sister Sarah, who had stolen my name, my background, and my opportunity for happiness. Sarah wore my engagement ring, carried my maiden name into marriage, and raised children who called her by the name that belonged to me. For 40 years, I watched from a distance as Sarah lived the life I should have had, using my identity to build a successful career, maintain a loving marriage, and raise a family while I struggled with poverty, isolation, and the constant confusion of being treated as if I were the imposter in my own life. But what I didn't know was that Sarah's identity theft had been documented in ways that would eventually allow me to prove who I really was and expose the elaborate fraud she'd been perpetrating for 4 decades. The discovery that changed everything happened by accident when I was 77 years old and applying for Social Security benefits under my real identity. The Social Security Administration informed me that there was already someone receiving benefits under my name and Social Security number, and that I would need to provide extensive documentation to prove that I was the real Margaret Thompson. The bureaucratic nightmare that followed led me to hire a private investigator and an attorney who specialized in identity theft cases. What they discovered was far more extensive and systematic than I could have imagined. Sarah hadn't just stolen my identity, she had created an elaborate paper trail that documented 40 years of her life being lived under my name, while simultaneously creating false records that suggested I was an unstable person who had been making false claims about my identity for decades. The investigation revealed that Sarah had been using forged documents, false witness statements, and even medical records, claiming that I suffered from delusional disorders that caused me to believe I was someone else. She had convinced doctors, social workers, and government officials that I was mentally ill and that my claims about being the real Margaret Thompson were symptoms of my psychological problems. But the private investigator found inconsistencies in Sarah's documentation that proved she had been living a lie for 40 years and that I was indeed the real Margaret Thompson who had been systematically robbed of my identity and my life. Little did I know that exposing Sarah's identity theft would reveal a criminal operation that had been targeting twins and other family members with similar appearances for decades. The attorney who represented me in my identity restoration case discovered that Sarah was part of a criminal network that specialized in long-term identity theft schemes, targeting family members who had similar physical appearances and access to each other's personal information. The network included corrupt government employees who helped falsify official records, medical professionals who created fake psychological evaluations to discredit identity theft victims, and legal experts who developed sophisticated documentation that made identity theft appear legitimate and irreversible. Sarah's case was just one example of dozens of similar schemes where criminals had stolen family members' identities and lived their lives for years or decades, while the real identity owners were marginalized, discredited, or even institutionalized to prevent them from exposing the fraud. But most disturbing, the investigation revealed that Sarah's identity theft had been profitable beyond just personal gain. She had been selling my personal information and documentation to other identity thieves who used my credentials to commit financial crimes and fraud throughout the country. Sarah had essentially turned my identity into a criminal enterprise, licensing my name, social security number, and personal history to other criminals, while ensuring that any legal consequences would fall on me rather than on the people actually committing the crimes. The scope of the criminal operation was staggering. Sarah's network had been operating for over 20 years, stealing the identities of hundreds of family members and selling their personal information to criminals throughout North America. If this story is shocking you, hit that subscribe button, because what happened when Sarah was finally confronted with evidence of her crimes will show you how deep identity theft networks can go and how they destroy entire families for profit. When FBI agents arrested Sarah at the house she'd been living in under my name, she initially tried to convince them that I was the imposter and that she was the real Margaret Thompson, who was being victimized by a mentally ill sister with delusional beliefs about identity theft. Sarah's performance was convincing and well-rehearsed. She had 40 years of documentation supporting her claim to be Margaret Thompson, along with medical records, witness statements, and legal documents that portrayed me as an unstable person with a history of making false identity claims. But the FBI had been investigating Sarah's criminal network for months, and had developed sophisticated techniques for detecting long-term identity theft that couldn't be fooled by forged documents or false witness statements. DNA testing, dental records, and detailed interviews with childhood friends and teachers who had known us before Sarah's identity theft began provided irrefutable proof that I was the real Margaret Thompson and that Sarah had been living a stolen life for 4 decades. The evidence against Sarah was overwhelming and undeniable. Bank records showed that she had been using my social security number to build credit and establish financial accounts since employment records demonstrated that she had been using my educational credentials to obtain jobs and professional licenses that should have belonged to me. Most damning, investigators found detailed records that Sarah had maintained documenting her identity theft operation, including step-by-step instructions for stealing family members' identities and strategies for discrediting the real identity owners if they ever tried to reclaim their lives. Sarah had been treating identity theft as a business operation, systematically documenting her methods and sharing techniques with other criminals who were running similar schemes targeting their own family members. During her interrogation, Sarah showed no remorse for destroying my life and seemed primarily concerned about the financial impact of her arrest on the criminal network she'd been operating. She described me as a business obstacle and referred to identity theft as resource optimization that made better use of personal credentials than the original owners could achieve. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed that Sarah was a textbook sociopath who had been escalating her criminal behavior over time and had been planning to expand her identity theft operations to include children and grandchildren of her existing victims. Sarah was charged with identity theft, fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy charges related to her criminal network. The prosecution argued that her crimes represented one of the most systematic and long-term approaches to identity theft ever prosecuted in federal court. The trial lasted 10 months and included testimony from dozens of identity theft victims, FBI investigators, and family members who had been deceived by Sarah's impersonation for decades. But the most emotional testimony came from Robert Mitchell, the man who had been married to Sarah for 38 years while believing she was me. Robert's testimony revealed the devastating impact of learning that his entire marriage had been built on a lie and that the woman he loved had stolen the identity of her twin sister. Robert described the confusion and betrayal of discovering that his wife wasn't the person he thought he'd married, and that the real Margaret Thompson, me, had been living in poverty and isolation while he built a life with the woman who had stolen her identity. The children Sarah had raised while using my name also testified about the trauma of learning that their mother had been living a stolen life and that they had been unknowingly participating in a 40-year identity theft scheme. Sarah's oldest daughter, who was 35 years old, described the psychological impact of discovering that her mother wasn't who she claimed to be and that her own birth certificate and family history were based on fraudulent documentation. The jury deliberated for 16 hours before finding Sarah guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced her to 25 years in federal prison, calling her crimes a systematic campaign of identity erasure that destroyed multiple lives and families through decades of calculated deception. But Sarah's conviction was just the beginning of a legal process that would ultimately result in the prosecution of 43 other individuals who had participated in various aspects of the identity theft network. The investigation revealed connections to government employees, medical professionals, and legal experts who had been helping criminals steal family members' identities and maintain those false identities for years or decades. Several corrupt Social Security Administration employees were prosecuted for helping create false identity records and for ignoring evidence that identity theft victims were trying to reclaim their legitimate identities. Medical professionals who had created fake psychological evaluations to discredit identity theft victims were also arrested and prosecuted, leading to significant reforms in how mental health claims are evaluated and documented. Today, 3 years after Sarah's conviction, I've legally reclaimed my identity and begun the long process of rebuilding the life that was stolen from me 40 years ago. The Social Security Administration has restored my benefits and updated their records to reflect my true identity and work history. I've also been able to reclaim my educational credentials and professional licenses that Sarah had been using fraudulently for decades. But the emotional and practical challenges of reclaiming a stolen identity after 40 years are enormous and ongoing. I've had to rebuild relationships with family members and friends who had believed Sarah was me for decades and convince them that I am the real Margaret Thompson who had been marginalized and discredited by my sister's criminal operation. The house that Sarah had been living in under my name has been transferred back to me, along with bank accounts, retirement funds, and other assets that rightfully belonged to me but had been controlled by my sister for 4 decades. I've also had to navigate the complex emotions of meeting Robert Mitchell and the children Sarah had raised while using my identity. These relationships are complicated by the fact that they represent the family I should have had but was denied due to my sister's crimes. Robert and I have developed a friendship based on our shared experience of being victimized by Sarah's deceptions, but the romantic relationship we might have had 40 years ago was destroyed by Sarah's identity theft and can never be recovered. The children Sarah raised are struggling with their own identity issues, having learned that their family history and even their mother's name were based on fraudulent documentation. They're working with therapists to understand their true family relationships and to develop healthy connections with both me and their father. I've become an advocate for identity theft prevention and work with law enforcement agencies to educate people about long-term identity theft schemes that target family members with similar physical appearances or access to personal information. My case has been featured in training materials for FBI investigators, Social Security Administration employees, and victim advocates who work with people trying to reclaim stolen identities. The identity theft industry has used my experience to develop new verification procedures and security measures that make it more difficult for criminals to maintain stolen identities for extended periods without detection. Share this story if it moved you, because long-term identity theft targeting family members is more common than most people realize. And sometimes the people who know us best are the ones who pose the greatest danger to our legal and financial security. I've learned that identity theft isn't just about financial fraud, it's about the complete erasure of a person's life, relationships, and opportunities for happiness and success. I've established new security procedures and monitoring systems that make it virtually impossible for anyone to use my identity fraudulently in the future, and I maintain regular contact with family members and friends to ensure that my relationships and reputation can't be manipulated by criminals. The 40 years that Sarah stole from me can never be recovered, but I'm using the time I have left to help other identity theft victims reclaim their lives and to prevent other families from experiencing the devastating betrayal that destroyed my relationship with my twin sister. Every month, I speak at conferences and community organizations about the warning signs of long-term identity theft and the importance of protecting personal information even from family members who might have criminal intentions. I've also worked with lawmakers to develop stronger penalties for identity theft crimes and better support systems for victims who are trying to reclaim stolen identities after years or decades of fraud. The identity theft network that Sarah operated has been completely dismantled, its leaders are serving long prison sentences, and the techniques they used to steal family members' identities are now known to law enforcement agencies throughout North America. Sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones who share our DNA and have unlimited access to our personal information and family relationships. But sometimes, when victims refuse to be erased and fight back against criminals who steal their very existence, justice can be served and other potential victims can be protected from similar crimes. Sarah thought she could steal my identity permanently because we were identical twins, and she had 40 years to establish false documentation that would make her theft irreversible. Instead, she learned that underestimating the determination and resources of a sister who refused to be erased was the mistake that would expose her entire criminal operation and restore my legal identity. My discovery of Sarah's identity theft wasn't just about reclaiming my name and social security number, it was about proving that my life had value and meaning that couldn't be stolen by criminals who saw family relationships as opportunities for exploitation. That's the power of refusing to accept false identity claims and choosing instead to fight for your right to exist as yourself, regardless of how sophisticated the criminals might be, or how long they've been living your stolen life. The photographs that showed Sarah wearing my wedding dress and living my life are now evidence in a federal investigation, but they also serve as reminders of how completely someone can steal your existence when they have access to your most personal information. Today, at 81 years old, I'm finally living as myself rather than as the discredited shadow of my twin sister's stolen identity, and I'm using every day I have left to help other identity theft victims reclaim their lives and identities. Sometimes the best way to heal from having your identity stolen is to use your experience to help other people protect themselves from criminals who see family relationships as opportunities for fraud and exploitation. Sarah will spend the next 25 years in prison, but I'll spend the rest of my life making sure her identity theft operation led to stronger protections for people whose family members might have criminal intentions. The twin sister who stole my life for 40 years gave me something unexpected in return, the knowledge and experience needed to help other people protect their identities from the criminals who are closest to them. That's the responsibility we all have when we recover from criminal victimization, to use our experiences to prevent other people from suffering similar crimes and to ensure that criminals can't continue targeting vulnerable family members with impunity.